Well, I'll just say, I'm looking forward to what you have to say. Because I've got questions, they've got questions, and we could all use a shot of something halfway hopeful. Bojan, Francuz, come talk to us.
This is on. How do you follow this introduction? It's really an honor for me to be here. This community, St. Norbert College, friends, professors, colleagues, they've given really so much. And I don't get emotional very often, and I don't go off script very often these days. But I just want to say that it's interesting to look back when I first came to DPIR as an 18-year-old from Serbia. My life has changed in so many beautiful ways, and in great part it is due to the opportunities that I had at St. Norbert College and the influences that I had from the people, many of them who are in this room. So thank you for that. That's the emotional part that I wanted to get out. But I want to thank you, Bob, for the generous introduction that you canvassed from the audience as well. I want to thank UWGB, the Motley Center, and thank St. Norbert, my alma mater, for welcoming me back. And this truly is coming back home. And maybe before I get into the world order and the future and all these messy topics, I want to say something specific about this place and the man whose name he carries. Father Motley did something that in many ways resembled what the UN set out to do. He brought in dialogue people of different faiths, of different backgrounds, against all odds, and from what I know from his book, with practically no money and a little budget in a small Midwestern city. And he made it last for 65 years or so. You have the right numbers. And it's really impressive. It means a lot to me to be in small part of his legacy as well. When I was a student at St. Norbert College, I was a devoted and regular attendee of the Great Decision Lecture Series. And I joked that, if they had a frequent flyer program, I would be platinum. There was also extra credit offered when you were a student, so there was definitely an incentive to be there too. These were early 2010s, time when we were trying to make sense of the Arab Spring and the popular uprisings across the Middle East. We had hoped that Twitter, keep in mind Twitter, right, that it would topple dictators and usher a new democratic age in the region and beyond. We had a variety of foreign policy experts who came through town. They were wrestling with wars in Afghanistan, in Iraq. They were debating exit strategies and what would be left behind. We discussed Latin America as well, and it's turned to the left at the time. There were hopes for rebuilding Haiti. We were grappling with the questions about drug cartels in Mexico and parsed the politics of the Persian Gulf. And now, 15 years later, I can report back what many of you already know all too well. The world is in many ways same. Drug cartels still have a foothold in Mexico, even if leadership has changed for some of the organization. Haiti has now been rebuilt. Quite the contrary, the gangs control capital, Port-au-Prince. The Persian Gulf is again in the news, screaming from the headlines. And by now, I think all of us have learned more than we ever expected about the Strait of Hormuz, including the width of the strait, 35 miles at its widest. And we also know pretty well the geography and choreography of oil tankers passing through or not passing through. And continue to have questions how many are actually getting through, as we can see it at the gas pumps, whether it's going up or down. And yet at the same time, I'm going to sound trite here, but change has come, right? Twitter and social media, they've democratized access to information, but also are now counted as one of the greatest threats to democracy abroad, but as many of you know, also here at home in the US. Disinformation, conspiracy theories, they've become weapon of mass disruption. Countries in Latin America, they turn left since 2010, then they turned right and left and then right again, as we've seen in elections in Bolivia, in Chile, in Costa Rica recently. And new technology and our AI-enabled, disabled world, it has really posed challenges that policymakers at the 2010 Great Decision lecture series could not even think about and dream about. On a personal level, I too have changed. I'm no longer in the audience, dozing off and listening to the questions. Now, as Bob was mentioning, I'm a participant, a small participant, but a participant actively shaping the debates about the future of international cooperation and the UN's role in it. I think it's important to say why I do it, to be very clear from the beginning. I do it because I believe that in the world that is this challenged, the institutions which are keeping alive our most enlightened ideals and ideas, they're worth fighting for. And I hope that by the end of this talk, I'll convince you that's the case as well. I mentioned that I think of Green Bay and the Pier as home, and I'm really grateful to be called back to one of my home ports to share my thoughts on this messy world. And maybe more importantly and personally, to try to answer the question whether I measure up to the challenge of my Norbertine education, to serve humanity and to care for all. It's a big challenge. The messiness of the current state of affairs makes making sense of the world extremely, extremely difficult. The ever-changing headlines leading up to this talk had me second-guessing what I should say up until the plane touched down this morning in Green Bay. I kept editing away. And I also want to say this, and I really do mean this genuinely, that having several of my former professors here in the audience really humbles me. For anything insightful that I say today, I really do owe it all to them. Thank you for that. For all the stupid things that I say and things that I omit, that's only my own. It's not all. Like you, I am also trying to make sense of the world that increasingly feels like it's sinking into the abyss. Well, also, as I said, I'm trying to help shape the world that will hopefully take its place. And it's on this point that I want to drill further on today, because the world no longer affords those of us who believe in peace, in universal rights, in the goodness of the strangers. It doesn't afford us the luxury of being meek or playing it safe. I think those times have come. When Bob asked me to speak today, I asked him back and said, well, what would the audience be interested in hearing? And he said, well, share what's it like from the inside the UN and what you think will look forward, what it will look like moving forward. And I was like, okay. So I decided to take this request seriously and to structure this talk in two ways. First, I want to tell you the story of the world as I see it today. And the second, I want to offer my best assessment and my honest prognostication of what becomes of multilateral institutions in this changing world order. I hope by the end of it, you'll see the United Nations not only as something that you read about in headlines, but feel what it actually feels from the inside, know more about its art, its silences, its failures, and its stubborn possibilities. And I hope you'll have a clearer sense of what it demands of people, of all of us. That's the deal, so let's get going. Let me find the clicker. I need some help here. I need help. Wow. There we go. The United Nations headquarters, some of you have been there. For those of you who haven't, it sits on the east side of Manhattan. It's about 18 acres of international territory. And when you first enter the Visitors Plaza, you're greeted by a bronze sculpture by an Italian artist, Arnaldo Pomodoro. It's called Sfera con Sfera, sphere within a sphere. It's large, polished outer globe, visibly cracked, revealing underneath a complex, turbulent inner sphere, which is rotating at its core. In many ways, it evokes complexity and fragility of the modern world. Fractures on the surface, concealing the chaotic world inside. And in many ways, this is exactly how I see the world today. the outer sphere, the system of rules, institutions, and norms that have been built after the Second World War II. And that system is visibly cracked. And then the inner world turning beneath it, well, it's fragmented, it's moving forward, and it's often violent. In this world, the closure of a single strait halfway across the globe disrupts fuel supplies on another continent. It prevents fertilizer from reaching farmers thousands of miles away and disrupts the harvest for many months after, and sends fuel and food prices surging in countries that had no role in the original conflict. Or as we were reminded not too long ago, a disease from the other side of the world can upend our health, our wellness, our economies within a week. So in many ways, the fragility that sculpture captured feels today, in many ways, like a prophecy. Voila. Now, as you enter the UN Plaza, you step away from the sphere. Within sphere, you get to the knotted gun. It's one of the most photographed sculptures on the UN complex. It's a 45 caliber revolver with a barrel tied in a knot, and its meaning is evident to everyone and very clear. But today I want us to remind that arms are plentiful around the world and the violence is again on the rise. So some statistics. From 2004 to 2014, there were about 160,000 people who were killed annually in violent conflict. Since 2016, and every year since, primarily driven by wars in Ukraine, Ethiopia, Sudan, across the Middle East, that number has increased eightfold. We see from the headlines, international law is an afterthought for the most powerful states and also the smallest extremist groups alike. Brute force is the order of the day. Threats on Twitter are order of the day. And we know from history that peace and the promise of peace was never perfect. We only have to think back to the 90s, to the horrors of Bosnia and Rwanda to be reminded of that. But I want to suggest here that today's conflict have a different character. They're fragmented. They involve multiple internal and external actors, each of them backing different sides. You can just think of the ongoing violence in Sudan, and we have some of the experts here, where two main factions are waging a brutal civil war for third year in a row, each supported by a competing external power in a different part of the world. The belligerents around the world are using new technologies, from AI-enabled target identification to commercial drones to cyber attacks on civilian infrastructure. These are the militaries and armies, but there are also gangs in Haiti. There are militias in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Everyone has access to a cheap drone that can explode and cause harm. And while we have fewer nuclear weapons today in the world than at the peak of the Cold War, global military expenditure on arms in 2024 reached 2.7 trillion American dollars. That's been the steepest year-on increase since the Cold War ended. So the world is armed to the teeth and it's rearming at a rapid pace. And again, we see that in the headlines as well. At the same time, the international machinery of arms control, so the treaties, agreements, and conventions, is sputtering away. The treaties that once governed transparency in arms transfer, limited nuclear weapons testing, and established guardrails on new technologies and how they should be used in our weapons, they're either abandoned or in many instances, they're simply ignored and discarded away. Even Finland, the country of Finland, recently left the Ottawa Convention, which prohibits the use of landmines. So when we find ourselves in the world where Finland is taking a step back from arms control treaty, it's a pretty bleak world. But let's move away from the knotted gun to walk along the visitors plaza. Just a few steps away is the sculpture by the name The Ark of No Return. It was unveiled in 2015 and has a very striking white marble that it's built from. It's built in triangular forms to represent the triangular route of the transatlantic slave trade. It honors 15 million victims and it stands as a memorial to reckoning and restoration. A reminder that as members of the international community, we're committed, at least in principle, to fighting racism and the legacy of exploitation in all of its forms. And some of you might have seen this in the news last week. I was thinking quite a lot about the arc of no return. Because last week, the United States, alongside only two other countries, its allies, Argentina and Israel, voted against a symbolic UN resolution recognizing the transatlantic slave trade. In the language of the resolution, I quote, as the gravest crime against humanity. It was a symbolic vote for the United States. There was no binding action to follow, and yet I couldn't help but think of a great American, Eleanor Roosevelt, a woman who I know you spoke about at the beginning of these lecture series. She chaired a commission that drafted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, a document that enshrines values not entirely different from those in the founding documents of this country: life, liberty, dignity for all. And the vote last week made me wonder what she would make of where we are today and where we're headed to. Now, we leave the outside and we walk into the General Assembly Hall building at the UN. And just as you enter there, you see a man with his hands raised up high and a big smile. That's the bronze statue of Nelson Mandela. Many of you know about him and his biography, but just a reminder that he spent 27 years in prison for daring to resist apartheid. And upon his release, he chose reconciliation over revenge and helped build democratic South Africa with all of its imperfections today. And it's okay to stand here and pause for a second and think about the state of democracy in this country and the world today. It's more uncertain than it has ever been. You have global democracy indexes that are tracking backsliding in 19 countries of the world. So you're seeing weakening rule of law, eroding rights, shrinking space for representation. Freedom House, a think tank down in DC, has recorded a global decline in freedom for 19 consecutive years. So 19 years, you've seen trends go the other way. That means that the slide downwards has begun before the 2008 financial crisis, before Brexit, before any other upheavals that we tend to blame. And for the first time in more than 20 years, the world now has fewer democracies than countries and societies that we would label as autocracies. At the turn of the millennium, democracy was seen as the inevitable direction in history, right? We had the end of history. But that story is over. Activists, human rights defenders, and journalists face documented threats, arrests, and worse. All of this is tracked and documented by the very UN mechanisms that countries built to hold each other accountable. Mandela, he stood for an idea that no system of oppression is permanent, that it can be dismantled and sometimes something better can be built in its place. That belief maybe feels a little bit harder to hold on right now, but it feels necessary. I'm really having bad luck with my clicker. I want to take you a little bit more on this tour. Just bear with me here. Because as you keep walking away from the Mandela statue, and you lower your gaze, you see 9 faces looking back at you from large silk carpets, which were a gift of a country of Iran to the UN. There are 9 men from different corners of the world who have in succession held what is often called the world's toughest job, the post of the UN Secretary General. A post also described as a post of a secular pope. So somebody who should speak for all of humanity, but has almost no power or no formal power to compel any of the actions. And as you see here, it's 9 men. And 9 men in an organization whose founding principle includes equal rights of men and women. 9 men in a row going on for 8 decades now. Well, this year, the UN will select its new Secretary General, its 10th Secretary General. And for the first time, the process is more transparent. Candidates now formally announce their candidacies. They present visions of how they see the UN in the future. There are several names which have emerged, primarily from the Latin American region. And I argue that it's finally time for the organization, for its highest office, to reflect the diversity it claims to represent. Whoever comes up on top and takes the office on January 1st of 2027 will have a very difficult to-do list to tackle. As you turn from the portraits and just around the corner there is a display case holding this flag. This tether flag is not a ceremonial piece. It's a remnant of the 2003 bombing of the Canal Hotel in Baghdad, which was the UN's regional office there. It was the first major targeted attack on the United Nations and its personnel. It killed 22 staff members, and it's often described as the loss of innocence for the organization. I think about that flag when the debates around the UN start to become abstract. Because the UN is not just some tower on the east side of Manhattan that has good intentions in it, some sculptures and art, and diplomats haggling over words and text. It is peacekeepers in South Sudan and Eastern Congo. It is aid workers in Gaza and Afghanistan. It's vaccine logistics coordinators and election monitors in places many people will never visit. Today, there are roughly 60,000 peacekeepers around the world, operating on a budget that's smaller than the budget of the NYPD, New York Police Department. Last week, 3 of these peacekeepers were killed while serving in Lebanon. And sadly, that's the trend we're seeing in conflicts around the world. There's a disregard for the lives of civilians, peacekeepers, aid workers, all of them alike. They've all become targets. And I should say, I will not stand here pretending that peacekeeping has been one of the most successful operations there is there. It has not always kept peace throughout its history. Some missions have been mired in the same status quo for decades. Others have struggled to respond to new threats from the centralized armed groups, drone warfare that I was mentioning, and tactics of the opponents that didn't exist when the peacekeeping mandates were created and the idea of peacekeeping was created as well. But at the same time, they remain the only international peace brigade we have that is not just strongly worded statements and condemnations or prayers to stop the war. So the tattered flag is a reminder that the cost of the work is real, and they should be humble about what it demands from those who actually do it. But this is where all of this has been taking us to. So I've given you a little bit of an architecture digest tour of the UN to end at this important place. It's small, and it's unassuming. It's tucked away in the northern corner of the General Assembly Hall building. It's easy to overlook by diplomats and visitors alike. And it's the UN's meditation room, a sacred space open to anyone regardless of faith, creed, and religion. At its center is 6.5-ton block of iron ore, which is polished on top to catch a single beam of light, which is focused from above. The walls you see carry a mural of abstract geometric forms, carefully designed not to mimic any specific religious symbols. There are no pews, there's no altar, there is just silence and stillness. The room itself was designed by Dag Hammarskjöld, the UN's second Secretary General, widely regarded as perhaps its greatest leader that it had in history. He was a Swedish economist and a minister in Swedish government before he was elevated to the position of a Secretary General. Many would say almost by accident, so much so that even he was surprised when he was tapped on the shoulder to lead the organization. And yet this quiet, unassuming man ended up leading some of the greatest revolution in the history of the UN. He reformed how the UN worked from the inside. He pioneered the concept of peacekeeping. He personally mediated conflicts around the world. And he transformed how international civil service understood its purpose to serve the world. But what I want to focus on and what I want to share is that he was also a deeply spiritual man. I think if he met Father Monty, they would probably get along. The meditation room was one of his many gifts to the world. And when he wrote about the meditation room, he said, and I quote, "There's an ancient saying that the sense of a vessel is not in its shell, but in the void. So it is with this room. It is for those who come here to fill the void with what they find in their center of stillness." I sat in that room, not often enough, but I've sat in it. Each one of us finds its own center of stillness somewhere different. Some in prayer, some in nature, some in music, some in conversation that cuts through the noise. But what Hammarskjöld understood is that stillness is non-passivity. It is the precondition for clear thinking. It is where the honest assessment becomes possible. It is where you stop reacting to every headline and start asking, what is actually happening and what does it require from me? I saw that stillness in preparing for today, and when the noise cleared, what I was left with was not despair. It was this. Without a doubt, the UN and the broader multilateral system have over the course of 80 years accomplished extraordinary feat. They've helped newly decolonized states secure their sovereignty. They've reduced number and scale of wars, especially in the turbulent years after the post-Cold War period. They've enabled the massive spread of wealth by setting global standards for economic developments and setting targets on poverty reductions. Countries working together through UN institutions, they've cured diseases, they've fed the displaced, they documented the atrocities so they could not be simply denied. Or recently, we can go to a concrete example. When Russia invaded Ukraine again in 2022, it triggered a global food crisis, and it was UN's Global Crisis Response Group that stood up immediate response despite the Security Council group. You might have heard about the Black Sea Grain Initiative, which helped stabilize the global food crisis and averted famine of millions around the world. The UN brokered it, they managed it, and the mechanism disbanded once its work was done. And that is maybe a sign of what agile multilateralism looks like in the 21st century, when the budgets are tight, political windows of opportunity are also narrow, but the needs are great. The systems were not perfect, they worked, and I would argue the world was better for them. But now we're in the year 2026, and all of that has been shaken. Again, one can only look at the headlines or the Twitter feed to know that the founding architects of the post-World War II order, primarily the United States and European countries, they're stepping back in a ways that would have been unimaginable just 10 years ago. Russia has torn the UN Charter by invading its sovereign neighbor. China continues to constrain freedoms of its ethnic minorities. European nations, for the first time since World War II, are disinvesting from peace and redirecting those funds away from peace and development to build up its military deterrence. In the United States, this country, the country whose signature is on the founding documents of nearly every major international institution, is withholding dues, defunding agencies, and articulating a vision of global engagement that is harder and harder to distinguish from disengagement. There is an Italian journalist, Giuliano D'Ampoli, who has called this moment the hour of the predator. And I think that's very apt for the moment that we're living in. We're seeing the rise of autocratic leaders and tech billionaires who treat chaos and division as tools to grab onto power rather than to solve society's problems. Many of the world's most powerful actors, they're looking out for their own interests first, producing disinformation, fueling corruption, and underwriting violence that's inherent in the system without clear rules. You might have heard Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney was spoken about the fundamental rupture in the international system. He was speaking in Davos a few months ago. He was talking about the end of an 80-year phase of relative order and stability. And he has said something else that's resonated with many people, and that is nostalgia is not a strategy. He was speaking to the governments, but he was also speaking to the institutions like the United Nations. And I would argue he was right. But the rupture I want to name here specifically is this. The supply of international mechanisms we have built, including the systems governing trade, security, climate, many other issues, is no longer meeting the moment of this time. And yet, at the same time, we have demand for global cooperation, which has never been higher. And then we have the capacity of existing institutions to deliver, which is felt ever lower. So as a result, in this out of whack demand supply system, you have states that are hedging. They're forming bilateral trade deals, they're forming smaller coalitions, regional and ad hoc groups to address the issues that they care about. President Trump recently announced Board of Peace, and he has described it as, I quote, looking over the United Nations and making sure it runs properly. Whether it's a compliment to the UN or a rival, it still remains unclear, regardless of how we feel about the peace. the one has to pay to join. So it is unsurprising that today many wonder openly whether multilateralism, right? So the idea that the states solve problems better together than alone, whether that idea has flatlined. There we go. And this is where I want to get to the second and maybe more difficult part of this talk that I wrestled with. Bob has asked me two other questions that I should try and answer. How does the UN become more robust, and where do we go from here? If I only had a blueprint to share. But I would say the task is not binary. It's not to abolish UN or to defend it blindly. Rather, it's to redeem it. To do the hard work of repairing a system which has become lame, but which we cannot afford to lose. And as we know from personal lives, redemption is often harder than both despair or nostalgia. It requires honest assessment of what has failed and a genuine commitment to building something more resilient in its place. History has shown us that geopolitical stress does not inevitably freeze global cooperation. Sometimes it can also drive innovation. The smallpox campaign in the 80s that UN led, it was at the height of Cold War. The Montreal Protocol on ozone depletion was negotiated while the Soviet Union was unraveling in the 90s. The Black Sea Grain Initiative that I was mentioning, it was assembled in weeks under fire with the Security Council that was deadlocked. Here's what most people actually know, even without following the UN closely. Three things. The world is more dangerous than it's been in decades. The problems that we face don't stop at borders, and none of us can solve them alone. I think we need to accept this, that this is not an ideology, it's just the reality of the situation that we find ourselves in. When they survey citizens around the world, they broadly support international cooperation. They have a clear intuition about what it's supposed to deliver: stability, fairness, and rules that apply to everyone. What they're often skeptical of is whether existing machinery can deliver that. And I would argue that skepticism is not irrational, actually. It's quite expected. But this creates a genuine opening for institutions willing to be honest about their limitations and serious about changing. Now, what could change look like? This is going to get a little bit wonky and think-tanky, but there are multiple ideas out there. Right? There are ideas that in development, the UN should focus on places and markets that are hardest to reach, the truly forgotten ones. There are ideas for decades-long peacekeeping missions that hold up the status quo to turn into faster, sharper diplomacy, something similar to Doug Hammarskjöld did in his day. There are also simple ideas to do more of what has worked. The Black Sea Grain Initiative, which showed that the UN can move fast, and once the mission is complete, move on. It's going to be interesting with the Strait of Hormuz and managing the flows there of fuel and particularly of fertilizer, whether a similar ad hoc mechanism can be set up, regardless of whether other commercial ships are going through. I think it's also important for the UN to stop pretending that it is the only table in the room. There are regional bodies, there are ad hoc coalitions, there are specialized forums, they all can carry weight. And I think also that confident UN should welcome all of that. We can solve our issues in a variety of forums. I do think that the UN and international governance in general should get ahead on AI governance of artificial intelligence, because whoever sets the standards in the next 5 years will shape the next 50 years and beyond. And I do think, and this idea has its followers and detractors, I do think that it's time to reform the UN Security Council. It's a body that was designed in 1945, and it's being asked to manage the conflicts of 2026. You have countries like Brazil, India, regional organizations like African Union, they've been knocking on that doors for decades, and they want their seat at the table. And as I was mentioning earlier, I'll go on a limb and say it's time to put a woman in charge of the international organization. 9 men in a row for an organization that's been founded on the idea of gender equality, equality of men and women, but that has to end, and we have a unique opportunity to do that this year. These ideas are not my own. They are ideas that are discussed by experts and diplomats in New York, Geneva, and beyond. They're discussed in capitals around the world. And they're even discussed in the corridors of State Department down in DC, where officials have engaged seriously with the question of the UN reform and have their vision of what the UN reform should look like. Which brings me to the tricky ground of my talk, and that's the country you cannot ignore when you talk about the future of international cooperation, when you talk about the future of multilateralism. That's the elephant in the room, and that's the United States. Scott Bessent, the US Treasury Secretary, he's been quoted saying, and I quote here, "America first doesn't mean America alone." But increasingly, that reassurance is hard to hear over the noise of actual policy and of the actual action of American diplomats in New York, of American State Department across the world. But I do want to caution and offer a note of historical perspective because I think it's important. This is not the first time the United States has had its doubts about the UN. In the 1950s, the FBI was raiding UN headquarters because it was convinced that there were communists operating within the organization's walls. In the late 1990s, members of the US Congress were genuinely scared of the black choppers, UN choppers flying over Montana. And they also worked to actively defund the organization. We have been here before. But in every previous episode, the United States did not relinquish its membership. It did not walk away. Even at the sharpest moments of domestic hostility towards the international organizations and towards the UN, American engagement continued. Imperfectly, fitfully, but it continued consistently. A couple of months ago, I was at the Munich Security Conference. Both the US and China, foreign ministers, and Marco Rubio, State Department, they were simultaneously in their intervention, they were touting and doubting UN international cooperation. Secretary Rubio would say in one breath, well, the UN still has tremendous potential to be a tool for good in the world. And then he would go to criticize the organization. But there's something different about this moment in time and about the US defunding disengagement and the US vision. It seems that the United States is intent on articulating a genuinely different vision of the world, not just a different strategy for achieving its old objectives. And at the same time, it's abandoning even the pretense of any shared principle. As a result, it may be losing something more valuable than it realizes. Its soft powers, its friends and allies, and ultimately its influence at the UN and on the global stage. As a result, we'll have to face the fact that a more disorganized world means more proxy wars, more resource extraction around the world, more lopsided deals that favor the strong over the vulnerable. But here's what I try to hold on to. We have to remind ourselves that cooperation is as old as civilization itself. Long before the UN, long before the League of Nations, before every treaty and convention and multilateral framework, human beings have built structures for solving shared problems together because the alternative has always been worse. I would argue that impulse has not disappeared in all of us. It's under pressure, it's being tested, but it's still with us and has not disappeared. And just because great powers are breaking the rules, it does not make those rules useless. A scholar of global governance, Francesco Mancini, he made that point very simply. He said, well, we don't abolish laws against theft because thieves exist. Thieves are exactly why you need a law, and you also need better burglar alarm systems. The fact that America and Russia and other countries are acting more coercively does not mean that the global rules have vanished. The majority of the world continues still to rely on them, specifically smaller and mid-sized countries. And I would argue that majority is still a constituency that's worth fighting for. And that majority is also a constituency that has an increasingly vocal voice at the United Nations. One of my favorite quotes that I repeat very often, and my friends are tired of hearing it, is that St. Augustine once said, "We are the times, such as we are, such are the times." Again, We are the times, such as we are, such are the times. But that also means we have power to change things. So the question is not whether international cooperation will survive the moment. History strongly suggests it will. The question is what form it will take place and who will get to shape it. I think a worry for many Americans is it's no longer going to be the United States. And the answer to that question, who will shape the world order, depends also in great part on the engaged citizenry, right? People like here in this room, folks who understand what's at stake, who are asking the hard questions of their leaders, and who are also refusing to treat the unraveling of the international order as an inevitable event, but rather as a set of choices that we're making. And those choices can be made differently. I want to close with a man who I was quoting throughout his intervention. And that's Doug Hammarskjöld. Because I think his words are exactly the right words for this moment. He said, our work for peace must begin within the private world of each one of us. To build for a man a world without fear, we must be without fear. To build a world of justice, we must be just. So that means we should not wait for the right leaders to be elected, not wait for the institutions like the UN to reform themselves, but within the private world of each one of us, start creating change first. This is a challenge to myself on a daily basis. This is a challenge to you. The messiness of this world is real. The stakes are high, and in some places, the stakes can be catastrophic. But the human beings build the systems that are not failing, and the human beings can build better ones. That has always been true, and I think it's still true today. Thank you very much.
All right, you raised a lot of things for us to talk about, which is great. One quick note, after we finish this more formal interaction of Q&A, in which I will bring a microphone to you if you have a question. We do have some cookies and things over there to encourage a little informal continuing conversation after we're finished. So first, who would like to ask the question? And for your sake, I won't call on your former professors first, although they will get their shot, I'm sure. Who has a question for Bojan Francuz? Christine.
Yeah, I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the speech of the Canadian Prime Minister at Davos when he said that the future will be to form different alliances, that you might have something in common with a particular country, but and what does that mean for international relations? Thank you.
Right. I can answer it right away. I think Carney's speech resonated with many people across the world. It resonated with folks, with diplomats, with folks in different capitals. What it spoke to is a truth that many of them have been feeling, and now it was said by a leader of a Western country, that this world that we built of international rules, laws, principles, it's world based on illusions. But when you speak to ambassadors of small and mid-sized countries, they said, we always knew that, but even having illusions help us have peace, security, prosperity. Things are changing now. And this is when I was speaking about this idea of there is a demand for cooperation. Foreign ministers, presidents, prime ministers are traveling around the world, establishing new trade deals, forming new alliances. And this is what Carney was speaking about. It's time to engage differently, to engage at the international institutions like the UN, but to engage in these ad hoc coalitions where you come together with a high ambition group of other countries who want to tackle climate or who want to improve trade. And you're seeing that also in some of the voting patterns at the UN today, where countries, smaller and mid-sized countries, are coming together and saying, Well, actually, this UN reform process, it seems like UN is cutting all these funds to please the Americans because Americans are dangling the funds. If you don't change this, we're not going to give you the funds. But you have a group of 30 countries, small to mid-sized countries, some European, some Latin American, some African, and a few Asian countries, who came together and said, well, wait, maybe we should actually proactively put our own reform proposals that the Secretariat and the UN leadership should consider, and not just retroactively respond to the blackmail, be direct, that's coming from Washington, D.C. So you're already starting to see that on a smaller scale, right, in some of the UN negotiations in New York, but you're also seeing it on a larger scale in the creation of new alliances. Maybe that's the future of multilateral cooperation. Ad hoc, mission-based over shared interests.
There's another hand.
Hi, I was late, I apologize. And where I was at a Veterans for Peace meeting. And your point about being involved is really important. And not doing something is not acceptable. We all, as a democratic nation, world, need to participate. And we're trying to figure out how veterans can help out with that story and that action. And it's important for us as a country and the world.
Thank you. Thank you for that. That relates to a question that I had for you, Bojan. As we think about the way we learn about the world, right now, most of our news is concentrated in the hands of about 3 wealthy people. And so we're not necessarily getting it straight. Even the other night when I was trying to see what was happening in Iran, I was seeing stories on Blue Sky and Twitter and social media that weren't hitting any of my dozen news sites that I would have looked at. I was all over the world for news sites, but I couldn't find that story. So I was like, okay, it's trending on Blue Sky and Twitter, but it's probably not real. How should we keep track of the goings on at the UN, which for many of us is a big black box there in Manhattan, and we don't know what's going on there.
Well, I hope it's a little bit less of a big black box in Manhattan. Like you're
For sure.
familiar with some geography, at least after the top. I mean, that's actually an exceptionally difficult question because the UN had its heyday in the media coverage in the post-Cold War moments of late 90s to early 2000s. And then after the early 2000s, there's a steep decline of also media organizations. Well, they're cutting their bureaus all around the world, and they've also been slashing their posts of the chief correspondent of the UN. So today, there aren't a whole lot of media representatives that are based at the UN that are covering UN on a day-to-day basis. There's a set of several think tanks, a couple of researchers, and maybe still a few outlets, namely Associated Press, so the Wires and Reuters, that will be reporting on major events at the UN. So it's exceptionally hard unless you know a few people to follow and a few commentators to follow, which I would be happy to share. But I think this is indicative of where does the organization today stand in relevance and in attention as well. And I'm not sure that I figured out how to fully fix that.
Okay, and I'm coming to you.
Speaking about things I don't know about, what is the UN position about climate change? Do they have a position? What are they doing about it? Because we know that the Earth is just going to continue to get hotter. There is no top temperature that it'll stop at until we stop putting the greenhouse gases into the atmosphere.
So I I get this question often, what is the UN position on XX? And the beautiful thing is the UN's position on things is the position of its 193 member countries. Whoever is in the majority, they get to set the direction, and they get to pass resolutions and statements on a certain issue. Sometimes they agree, sometimes they only have 70 countries that are supporting certain statements or issues. So that's the part that I want to delineate, that there isn't necessarily a single UN position on these issues. But we do have international agreements that countries have come around, and you probably all heard about the Paris Climate Agreement, that sets out and acknowledges that the climate change is real, and that there are certain targets that countries should be working towards to address the climate change problem. The reason why you might have heard about the Paris Climate Agreement is twice now, I believe, the US administration has exited the agreement. So you can sign the agreement and say, I support it, I'm going to be working towards these targets. And then the new administration can come in and say, well, actually, we don't want to be working towards these goals and targets, and we have other priorities. So currently, the US is not part of the Paris Agreement. And at the same time, you do have governors across this country, you have cities across this country who say, okay, maybe the federal government that deals with our foreign policy is not implementing these targets in this international agreement. But me as a governor of XX state, or me as a mayor of a mid-sized city, I'm going to copy these targets and I'm going to be working towards it within my jurisdiction. So that's a beauty of the American system, I would argue, this the centralized government that you have, that in some instances, when your federal government is not doing what you would like it to do, there are leaders at other levels of governments that might step up in some ways.
Before we can remind center losing your body. Okay, other questions? Second.
You mentioned how there were like a few times where the US was like a little more aggressive towards the UN, one in the 1990s and a few times before. Is this a similar time where it might be just a blip and maybe with this administration maybe hopefully at least in 2028? Or do you think it's like a new position for the US that might continue and further like or create our relationship with the United Nations?
There are two ways to answer this question. One of the ways that you can answer this question is to look at the constructive relationship that the current US ambassador to the UN has with the Secretary General. They meet on a weekly basis, and they're working together, sure, to implement some of the reforms of the UN, and to hopefully release some of the US funds so the organizations can continue to exist. So that's the hopeful way. So that will kind of go speak to the theory of like, it's just another blip like we've seen in the late 90s and we've seen in the other parts of history. But I do wonder, as I was saying even earlier, whether this time it's different. That this time it feels that there is a very different vision of the world that's coming from Washington, D.C., that's being projected across the world, but also at the United Nations. Does that mean that the US will leave the United Nations? No. Does that mean that the Board of Peace has more legitimacy or that it's functioning properly? I would argue no as well. But it remains to be seen, and the fear among many UN officials, the fear among diplomats from other countries, that this time it does truly feel different. And at the same time, I should say about the Board of Peace, I mean, the thing that's interesting is there is the Global Board of Peace, and there's a subcommittee, which is the Gaza Executive Board of Peace. One of the board members of the organization that I work for is a former Dutch foreign minister, and I was with her in Munich. And she's one of the two women who sits on the Gaza Executive Board of Peace. And I asked her, how do you square away? You were a long time serving UN official, you were a humanitarian coordinator in Gaza, and then you retired, left politics, and now they tapped you for this Gaza Executive Board of Peace. Like, what's the difference that you're trying to make? Well, she said, listen, first of all, I would much rather be in the room to try to help people than be outside of the room. Secondly, and this was in February when I saw her, she was like, there was nothing. There's an announcement, but nobody has brought this Gaza executive board together. Nobody has moved anything in any way, shape, or form. That might have changed since February, but I doubt it. And then the third thing is the Gaza executive board actually has a backing of the UN Security Council. So even then, the American administrations found it important to pass a resolution in the UN Security Council authorizing the Gaza Executive Board of Peace. So not the whole, not the big Board of Peace, but the Gaza Executive Board of Peace. And that's why many countries support this subcommittee of a larger Board of Peace. And you might have seen even some of the statements, a lot of Arab countries say, yeah, we're going to join the Gaza Executive Board because we believe that in this for this conflict and for this problem, it can solve it, but we're not going to be part of this bigger $1 million pay-as-you-go chairman for life option.
So I have somewhat of a philosophical question for you. That if I understood what you said, this is the first time, maybe ever, that there are more autocracies than there are democracies that are part of the United Nations. And one of the criticisms you hear, and I don't necessarily agree with this, but I want to play devil's advocate and hear your defense for multilateralism in the UN. What would you say to people who are critics of the UN who say, why should a multilateral organization like the UN that is made up of more autocracies than democracies be in a position to tell, well, the United States is not in a very good position right now, but let's say Europe or the United States 2 or 3 years ago, what it should do if, in fact, the majority are not democracies that buy into human rights or democracy, freedom, and multilateralism within their own countries?
Yeah, I mean, I would argue if you are a member of the United Nations, you sign on to the Charter of the United Nations, right, which is the founding document. You sign on to the other conventions that come along with it, Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And those are the values that this club, that's what ultimately it is, those are the values that this club should advance. And we live in a world where the interpretations of those values are different by different governments. And I think that's okay. That changes from administration to administration. It's okay to have disagreements. It's okay to have different visions of the world. But what I think is important and what I want to over-index on is this idea that you solve those differences within a rules-based order and within the institutions that we have set up, however imperfect, and I have a lot of criticism of them. But I would much rather see many autocracies and a few democracies disagreeing in the General Assembly Hall of the UN than I would like to see the law of the jungle take over, where those autocracies would be making decisions willy-nilly to invade its neighbors, take any other form of aggressive belligerent action. So I don't know if that fully answers it, but yeah.
Well, yeah, wonderful to see you, first of all. Since you mentioned Sudan, obviously I have to ask you a question. And you just referenced the law of the jungle, and that seems appropriate. Here we have a sovereign nation, and of course I'm referring to the Republic of Sudan, now the Northern Sudan, formerly, well, what used to be the Northern Sudan, now the Republic of Sudan. We have a country that is a sovereign nation that is actively tearing itself apart at the behest of 2 generals, as you mentioned, Bojan and Hameti. And this horrible destruction of the country and its institutions and the killing and human rights violations of hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people, is being done with the active participation of countries like Russia and the Emirates, which benefit from the gold of the Sudan, which they're actively exploiting. I'm wondering how, when we have a country that is tearing itself apart and others are piling on top, stealing whatever they can, how does the UN get involved when its own members are actively involved in this? And to further complicate it, when the Sudanese people themselves can't seem to decide what constitutes their own nation.
Dr. Kramer, always the most difficult questions. This is what I was speaking about, the types of conflicts that we're seeing is external actors playing a prominent role in conflicts in other parts.
We're really having a hard time.
You're not-
Sorry.
That might solve all the hearing problems now.
Let's try.
Okay. Better?
I think, are we,
We're good?
is that better? No?
Well,
Here, let's take that off.
Hello.
Yes.
That better?
Yeah.
Excellent.
Okay.
Cool. I just think it needs to go further up. The short answer is I don't know how to solve this Rubik's Cube of influences that are playing out in Sudan. They've been playing out in Libya. They're playing out in many other conflicts. What I do know, where do the international organizations like the UN come in? And more they've been seen as the emergency that comes after the accident has taken place. They're seen as humanitarians who are going to be feeding, clothing people, who are going to be documenting some of the atrocities, but that does not solve the problem in the first place. And I would argue this is maybe my own biggest criticism of the organization itself, that it's not playing a role in preventing conflict and mediating some of these regional and global great power rivalries. To do that, you need leadership who's willing to engage in shuttle diplomacy, who's willing to name and shame regional power players and global powers. And I don't think that exists today within international organizations. Maybe it will after January 1st, but I don't think change happens within a span of months. It doesn't just happen with one person who comes into the office. But there's something about that spirit of Doug Hammarskjöld and other leaders that have mediated many conflicts that were involved from the very beginning. Israel, Palestine, Egypt, Israel, and one can go on and on. One does not see that today. And I would argue that comes back to the lack of courageous leadership in multilateral institutions. I don't know how you change that unless you change the whole leadership setup.
Thank you, Bojan, and we'll go back to 2010 for a moment here and talk about Security Council reform. We know that the UN was never created with the idea that all countries would be created equal, or they would have created a Security Council that was more democratic, which they didn't. In the Security Council, it's not only the most powerful organ, but the P5 had more power than the rest of the nations. Within the P5, the US has been the most powerful, but also the least experienced. It only has 250 years. The other countries have much more experienced nations than the United States. And for many years now, especially in the 21st century, we've seen the gradual rise of China, which seemed to be just something we would say the peaceful rise of China. But many would argue that with the most recent events, China really comes out gaining, because both Russia and the United States are fighting wars, and Russia and China again is investing in artificial intelligence and clean energy. It's invested in creating all types of relationships with countries all over the world. So from the point of view of the United Nations, we know that the Security Council reform can only come when you have a new world order. How do you see the role of China from within in this new era of world politics?
One word answer: assertive. Assertive on all fronts, and maybe that's not very surprising because you see that all across the world. It's interesting that at the UN for a long time they talked about the P5, the permanent 5 members, and they would talk about P3. They would talk about, and when they said P3, they meant US, UK, and France, right? The 3 out of the 5 permanent members that were oftentimes on the same page, advancing similar values. Today, when people talk about P3, they don't mean those 3 countries. They mean the US, Russia, and China, which oftentimes actually find themselves aligned on some of the issues at the UN. On the issue of UN reform, Chinese ambassador and the US ambassadors are working hand in glove. Now you might wonder, well, why is that the case? And then you just look at how the membership dues to the UN are assessed. Currently, the US pays, because of the size of its economy, population, the US pays about 25% of the UN budget, so a quarter. The next country that pays the second highest is China, about 23%. In 2 to 3 years, because of the size of the Chinese economy and its population, number one country contributor to the UN budget will be China. And all of a sudden, they find common ground with the US because, well, we're going to be paying more, you're paying a lot, so we have a common interest to work on making the UN more efficient and to work together on UN reforms. So there are some instances where this P3 is coming together on the same line. You have the issue of the selection of the next Secretary General. Again, before you have to be garnering the support of US, you have to speak French to get the French vote and get the Brits on board. Now you really need to make sure that you please the Americans, the Russians, and the Chinese, the new P3. So we're seeing that, and then also we're seeing at the same time China playing assertive roles by promoting its nationals in the high leadership positions at the UN across a variety of agencies. And then goes back to the money, right? If we're paying higher dues to the UN, we actually want to see our nationals leading some of these organizations and setting rules and standards there as well. For the first time, China is not just taking a backseat and observing what's happening, which has often been the case in the dynamic of the Security Council, but China is taking a more proactive role. They're paying more money to the organization. They want to see their leadership, their nationals lead the organization. And at the same time, more and more, they want to be the ones who are advancing certain ideas because they do have, in some instances, even their military being under the blue helmets, leading missions. I think in South Sudan and potentially even in Sudan at some point, there were Chinese contingents in peace, which was not very common in the past.
Okay, I think we have time for one more. Patrick, you got it.
I was just wondering, because in January, there'll be a new Secretary General elected. How does that process work? Is it all the countries will vote on this person? Is there someone that is out there, like beating the bushes to try to get the position, or how is that going on?
The process itself, up until 2015, when the last elections took place, when Antonio Guterres from Portugal was elevated in the role, many have compared it to being more secretive than the papal conclave. So that's been up until 2015. In 2015, for the first time, all the countries come together and say, well, this is ridiculous. One does not choose the leader of the organization in hidden smoke-filled rooms. So they set up a process where whoever is a candidate, their country needs to nominate them and say, hey, we have this man or woman, we support them, we think they should be a candidate for the Secretary General. They go through a series of public hearings. So they go to a job interview in front of 193 member states for 2 hours. So we get to ask them questions. They get to set out their vision of what the UN should look like, which is uploaded publicly available right next to their resume. And we celebrate all that as a success. And that's also going to be the process this year. And at the same time, the way process officially works is members of the Security Council get together in a room and they pick a name or several names from this pile. They get to vote on it. Once members of the Security Council, so all 15 members, but in reality, only permanent 5 who have the veto, once they've decided the candidate, they send a text of resolution to the General Assembly, so to the 193 countries, and they say, we recommend X person to serve for a term of 5 years. And generally, the General Assembly says yes, because nobody wants to challenge the recommendation of the Security Council. So that's been the practice before. More transparency in terms that we know who the candidates are, we know their visions, we know some of the ideas they have, and they answer some of the questions. But in reality, it's still a process that takes place among the permanent 5 members of the Security Council. There are currently publicly available candidates. So if you Google, you'll see there are 4 of them. Candidate from Argentina, who's currently the head of UN's nuclear watchdog agency, IAEA. There's a candidate from Chile, former president of Chile, Michelle Bachelet. And there is a candidate from Africa, from Senegal, former prime minister, president as well, Macky Sall. And I am forgetting, there's also a candidate from Costa Rica, who was a former foreign minister of Costa Rica, and up until recently was the head of UN's Trade and Development Agency. And many more candidates are expected. One of the surest way for somebody to become a Secretary General and succeed in the race is for their name not to be known until the last minute. Somebody who's a skilled operator behind the scenes, who manages to garner the support of the new P3, is most likely to come on top. So a name that none of the names that I mentioned, and none of the names likely that will be familiar to most of you that are also not familiar to most diplomats in New York. I mean, that's been the case. I referenced Doug Hammarskjöld, right? He was selected in the 60s. And there are some great anecdotes where when he got the telegram in Stockholm in his office, everyone was surprised and thought it was a joke. But he